"Handcuff her now!" The command cracked through the federal courtroom before anyone had time to breathe, slicing across the polished oak benches and echoing beneath the towering ceiling of the United States District Court in downtown Atlanta, Georgia. Every conversation stopped, every chair creaked, every camera swung toward the center aisle. Assistant U.S. Attorney Ava Brooks had been standing only a few feet from the witness stand, one hand resting on a stack of evidence binders, the other holding a yellow legal pad filled with notes she had spent months preparing. She didn't move. She didn't protest. Her dark brown eyes remained fixed on the federal judge as two uniformed court officers approached with measured steps, their expressions tense but professional. The metallic click of handcuffs seemed impossibly loud in the stunned silence. Gasps rippled across the gallery where reporters, law students, victims, and executives all stared in disbelief. On the front row, Richard Caldwell slowly leaned back in his tailored Navy suit. The billionaire construction executive had spent the past 6 weeks listening, as Ava methodically dismantled the corruption network prosecutors claimed had diverted hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars into shell companies and secret offshore accounts. For the first time since the trial had begun, a faint smile appeared on his face. Television cameras broadcasting the proceedings live zoomed closer without hesitation. News alerts began appearing across phones throughout the courtroom before the officers even reached Ava. Federal prosecutor arrested during high-profile corruption trial. The headlines spread faster than anyone could verify it. Somewhere behind the reporters, a woman whispered, "I knew something wasn't right about this case." Another voice answered almost immediately, "They wouldn't arrest a prosecutor unless they had proof." Ava heard every word, yet her expression remained calm. She slowly placed her legal pad on the counsel table, carefully aligning it beside the evidence folders, as though tomorrow's work still mattered. Judge Harold Whitmore adjusted his reading glasses and frowned from the bench. His gavel remained untouched. The proceedings had not officially stopped, but the room no longer belonged to the court. It belonged to confusion. Captain Daniel Reeves, commander of courthouse security, stepped forward holding a sealed envelope. His face carried none of the satisfaction television cameras searched for. Instead, there was hesitation, the kind worn by someone following orders he wished he had never received. Miss7.org gay7t.com. "Brooks," he said evenly, "we have a federal arrest warrant issued this morning." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Ava finally looked toward him. "May I see it?" she asked quietly. Reeves hesitated for barely a second before handing over the folded document. Ava scanned only the first page. She neither argued nor raised her voice. Instead, she lifted her eyes toward Judge Whitmore. "Your Honor," she said with remarkable composure, "before I am removed from this courtroom, I respectfully request that the authenticity of this warrant be verified by the court." The request hung in the air. No anger, no panelly, just precision. Reporters exchanged confused glances. They had expected outrage, denial, perhaps tears. Instead, the young prosecutor spoke with the same measured confidence she had displayed throughout every day of testimony. Richard Caldwell's smile faded almost imperceptibly. Across the jury box, 12 ordinary citizens watched in complete silence. Several looked at one another, unsure whether they were witnessing the collapse of the prosecution or something far stranger. Judge Whitmore accepted the warrant from Captain Reeves and lowered his gaze to the signature at the bottom. His brow tightened almost instantly. It was subtle, a movement so slight that few people noticed it. Ava did. She remained perfectly still as the officers secured the handcuffs around her wrists. The cold steel reflected the bright courtroom lights while camera shutters fired relentlessly from every direction. Outside the courthouse, helicopters circled above downtown Atlanta. Inside, not a single juror looked away from the young black prosecutor standing alone before the entire nation, waiting with extraordinary patience for someone else to discover what she had already seen. Ava Brooks had never imagined that the most important day of her career would arrive with cold steel around her wrists. Yet the calm that settled across her face had been forged years before anyone inside that courtroom had ever heard her name. She had grown up nearly 100 miles south of Atlanta in the quiet city of Macon, Georgia, where her father, Raymond Brooks, spent 26 years serving in the United States Marine Corps before becoming a high school history teacher, and where her mother, Denise Brooks, taught third grade at the neighborhood elementary school. Their modest brick home sat at the end of a tree-lined street, where summer evenings smelled of fresh-cut grass and children still raced bicycles until the streetlights came on. Raymond often reminded his daughter that character was measured most clearly when everyone else misunderstood you. Denise believed that education could open doors, no prejudice could permanently close. Around the dinner table, they rarely talked about wealth or status. They talked about responsibility. When Ava was 12 years old, she asked her father why some people seemed to escape consequences, while others were judged before they even had a chance to explain themselves. Raymond looked at her quietly before sliding a worn copy of the United States Constitution across the table. Because justice only survives when honest people refuse to walk away, he told her. Those words stayed with her through every chapter of her life. She graduated at the top of her class from Howard University before earning her law degree at Harvard Law School, where professors quickly noticed that she prepared every argument with relentless precision rather than dramatic speeches. While many students competed to sound impressive, Ava focused on evidence, timelines, and facts that could withstand the toughest scrutiny. One professor jokingly called her the woman who never left a loose thread. She smiled politely but never accepted the compliment as enough. After graduation, prestigious private firms offered salaries that could have changed her family's financial future overnight. She declined every one of them. Instead, she accepted a position with the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Georgia, choosing public service over corporate law despite the enormous difference in pay. Friends questioned the decision. Former classmates could not understand why someone with her credentials would willingly step into difficult prosecutions instead of comfortable boardrooms. Ava always gave the same answer. The law belongs to everyone, not only to those who can afford the best lawyers. Over the next 7 years, she quietly built a reputation that spread through federal courthouses across Georgia. She never leaked information to reporters. She never celebrated convictions in front of cameras. She treated defendants respectfully inside the courtroom, believing dignity strengthened the legal process rather than weakened it. Judges appreciated her preparation. Investigators trusted her discipline. Even defense attorneys who challenged her arguments often admitted she played by the rules. That reputation became especially important when the Caldwell corruption investigation landed on her desk nearly 18 months earlier. The case arrived in dozens of storage boxes filled with financial records, procurement contracts, bank transfers, encrypted messages, and witness interviews collected by federal investigators. Many prosecutors believed the evidence was too complicated for a jury to follow. Others quietly warned that too many influential names appeared throughout the files. Ava never flinched. Night after night, the lights inside her office remained on, long after neighboring floors had emptied. Coffee cups accumulated beside stacks of documents marked with handwritten notes in careful blue ink. Federal Bureau of Investigation Special Agent Marcus Ellis often arrived before sunrise carrying another box of records. "You should go home sometime," he joked one morning, as he placed fresh evidence on her desk. Ava smiled without looking up from the spreadsheet she had been reviewing. "After we understand every page," she replied. Marcus laughed softly because he already knew that answer. Together they uncovered patterns hidden beneath thousands of ordinary transactions, each discovery revealing another layer of a network that reached far beyond a single executive. By the time the trial finally began in downtown Atlanta, Ava understood every witness, every document, and every timeline well enough to recite them from memory. She also understood something few others realized. Powerful people rarely surrendered quietly when the truth came within reach. While television commentators speculated about the shocking arrest unfolding inside the courthouse, almost none of them understood why the trial had terrified so many influential people long before the first witness ever took the stand. Richard Caldwell had spent more than 3 decades building Caldwell Infrastructure into one of the largest government contractors in the Southeast. His company had constructed highways, bridges, municipal buildings, and transportation projects across Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. Magazine covers praised him as a visionary entrepreneur. Governors invited him to economic development conferences. Universities welcomed him as a guest speaker. Charities honored him with awards for generous donations that funded hospitals, scholarship programs, and community centers. To the public, Richard Caldwell represented success earned through discipline and ambition. Behind closed boardroom doors, however, federal investigators had quietly assembled a far more complicated picture. Contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars appeared to flow repeatedly toward businesses connected through layers of consulting firms, limited liability companies, and financial partnerships that seemed unrelated until specialists mapped every transaction across several years. Money disappeared through accounts scattered across multiple states before returning to organizations linked to people who insisted they had never met each other. Individually, each payment looked ordinary. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. That pattern became Ava Brooks's responsibility. The deeper she examined the records, the more resistance appeared. Witnesses suddenly declined interviews after initially agreeing to cooperate. Accountants who had volunteered information retained expensive legal counsel almost overnight. Internal company emails vanished from archive servers shortly before investigators requested them. Even routine subpoenas that normally required only days to complete stretched into weeks because someone always seemed to know what investigators were looking for before official requests arrived. Federal Bureau of Investigation Special Agent Marcus Ellis noticed the same problem. One evening, while reviewing transaction logs inside the Atlanta field office, he slid another folder across Ava's conference table. "Someone keeps moving one step ahead of us," he said quietly. Ava studied the latest financial timeline before answering. "That means someone believes they still have control." Marcus folded his arms. "Do you think the leak is inside the investigation?" Ava looked toward the wall covered with flowcharts connecting executives, vendors, and public officials. Colored strings stretched between photographs, invoices, contracts, and bank statements until the entire board resembled an enormous puzzle. She remained silent for several seconds before replying. "I think somebody spent years convincing people that they are untouchable." As trial preparations continued, Richard Caldwell maintained absolute confidence in public appearances. Reporters waiting outside federal court frequently asked whether he feared the government's case. He smiled comfortably every time. "The truth has a way of finding daylight," he answered during one interview before stepping into a waiting sport utility vehicle surrounded by advisors. His attorneys projected similar certainty inside the courtroom. Every objection arrived quickly. Every witness was challenged aggressively but professionally. Every procedural delay bought additional time. Still, something slowly shifted as Ava presented financial records one document at a time. Instead of relying on dramatic accusations, she built the case through ordinary details that fit together with remarkable precision. Jurors filled notebooks with dates, account numbers, and testimony. Judge Harold Whitmore repeatedly complimented both legal teams for maintaining professionalism despite the extraordinary complexity of the evidence. Then came the development that changed everything. A former financial compliance manager employed by one of Caldwell's subcontractors agreed to testify under oath after months of negotiations. According to investigators, the witness possessed first-hand knowledge, explaining how confidential bidding information had been manipulated before government contracts were awarded. The testimony promised to connect years of suspicious transactions into one coherent story. News organizations described the witness as the turning point of the entire trial. Richard Caldwell no longer smiled quite as often. During recesses, he whispered with attorneys behind closed conference room doors, while consultants hurried through courthouse hallways carrying thick binders filled with legal strategy. Outside, satellite trucks multiplied along the sidewalks as national networks prepared for what many believed would become one of the most significant public corruption cases in recent Georgia history. Inside the courtroom, Ava reviewed her examination outline one final time, unaware that before the witness could answer a single question, an entirely different plan had already been set into motion. Captain Daniel Reeves had executed thousands of court security procedures during his career, and every one of them depended on a single principle that had never failed him before that morning. Trust the paperwork. Trust the chain of command. Trust that every document arriving through official channels had already been verified by someone above his authority. At 8:37 that morning, less than an hour before court convened, an encrypted notification reached the courthouse security office, marked with the highest internal priority. Attached was a federal arrest warrant bearing official formatting, a digital authorization code, and what appeared to be the electronic signature of a magistrate judge from another district. The accompanying instruction was direct. The arrest was to occur only after the prosecution completed its opening examination of the next witness in order to avoid disrupting court scheduling. Reeves reviewed the paperwork twice. Everything appeared authentic. Even the routing numbers matched previous federal communications he had processed over the years. Still, something unsettled him. The timing made little sense. Prosecutors were almost never arrested in the middle of an active federal trial, especially not without advance coordination with the presiding judge. He called the contact number listed in the notification. A calm voice answered, confirmed the warrant, and instructed him to proceed exactly as written. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When Reeves hung up, his instincts remained uneasy, but every procedural box appeared checked. By the time the courtroom filled with attorneys, jurors, reporters, and spectators, the operation had already begun moving quietly beneath the surface. 2 deputy officers took positions near the rear entrance. Another remained outside the courtroom doors to coordinate radio traffic. None of them knew why the warrant had been issued. None of them questioned its legality because every document in front of them suggested it had already survived multiple layers of federal review. Meanwhile, Ava Brooks organized her exhibits exactly as she always did. She placed witness outlines in chronological order, reviewed several handwritten notes, and exchanged a brief greeting with Marcus Ellis before taking her place at counsel table. Marcus noticed nothing unusual, except that courthouse security seemed unusually active in the hallway. "Busy morning," he remarked softly. Ava glanced toward the open doorway where several officers briefly passed by. "Perhaps another high-profile hearing," she replied before returning her attention to the evidence binder. Neither of them imagined those officers had been assigned to her. Across the aisle, Richard Caldwell quietly adjusted the silver cufflinks beneath the sleeves of his tailored jacket. One of his attorneys leaned closer and whispered something too quietly for anyone nearby to hear. Caldwell responded with only the slightest nod before directing his attention toward the witness stand. His expression revealed nothing beyond patient confidence, yet there was an unusual stillness about him, as though he believed an invisible clock had almost reached its appointed moment. Judge Harold Whitmore entered promptly at 9 o'clock. The courtroom rose together before settling back into respectful silence. The next witness was escorted inside, sworn under oath, and seated. Ava approached with measured confidence, asking several introductory questions that established the witness's employment history and responsibilities within the contracting process. Each answer added another careful layer to the government's case. Jurors followed attentively, comparing testimony with notes collected during previous sessions. Television cameras captured every exchange for viewers across the country. Then, just as Ava prepared to display a financial document expected to connect several companies directly to Caldwell's network, the rear courtroom doors opened with deliberate purpose. Captain Reeves entered first, followed by the officers assigned to assist him. Every head slowly turned. The witness stopped speaking. Defense attorneys exchanged puzzled glances. Judge Whitmore looked over the rim of his glasses, clearly surprised by the interruption. Reeves walked forward with disciplined restraint until he reached the center of the courtroom. His voice remained respectful but firm. "Miss Brooks, I have been instructed to execute a federal arrest warrant." For a heartbeat, no one reacted. The words seemed almost impossible to process. Reporters lowered their pens before instantly lifting them again. Jurors stared toward Ava in complete disbelief. Marcus Ellis rose halfway from his chair, his instincts urging him to object, yet years of professional discipline held him in place. Ava slowly accepted the document, reading only enough to recognize one detail that almost everyone else overlooked. Instead of arguing, she lifted her eyes toward the bench with complete composure. "Your Honor," she said clearly enough for every microphone in the courtroom to capture each word. "Before this court takes another step, I respectfully ask that you personally verify the origin of this warrant because something about it does not belong." The courtroom no longer sounded like a place where justice was decided. It sounded like a room filled with assumptions. Reporters rushed toward the aisle as far as the marshals would allow, speaking into microphones before a single fact had been confirmed. Television producers interrupted scheduled programming with breaking news banners that flashed across screens throughout the country. Social media filled with speculation at astonishing speed, Some people expressed disbelief. Others declared Ava Brooks guilty without waiting for evidence. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered behind security barriers, watching live coverage on oversized news vans parked along the sidewalk. Inside, the atmosphere grew heavier with every passing second. Captain Daniel Reeves stood motionless, his hand resting against the sealed warrant folder, watching Judge Harold Whitmore examine the paperwork in complete silence. The officers beside him remained professional, yet uncertainty had begun replacing confidence. They had expected resistance, angry arguments, perhaps demands for immediate legal counsel. Instead, the woman standing before them had offered only one request: verify the warrant, nothing more. Ava remained exactly where she had been instructed to stand. The steel around her wrists reflected the bright courtroom lights, but she refused to lower her head. Her breathing stayed slow and steady. She understood that every camera inside the room was searching for one emotional reaction that could become tomorrow's headline. She would not give them one. Across the gallery, whispers became louder. She knew too much. Maybe the investigation was corrupt all along. I always wondered how someone so young got a case this important. Every sentence reached her ears, but she answered none of them. Marcus Ellis could barely hide his frustration. Years of working beside Ava had taught him that she documented every meeting, every phone call, every piece of evidence with extraordinary discipline. The accusations spreading across television screens contradicted everything he knew about her character. He stepped toward the bench before stopping himself. Interrupting the judge would only create more confusion. Instead, he quietly opened his notebook and began writing down the exact sequence of events from memory, recording the arrival time of the officers, the wording of the announcement, and every visible detail surrounding the warrant. Habit told him that facts mattered most when emotions threatened to replace them. At the defense table, Richard Caldwell folded his hands calmly in front of him. His attorneys exchanged restrained glances that seemed carefully designed to avoid attracting attention. One lawyer leaned toward him and whispered, "This changes everything." Caldwell answered without looking away from the bench, "Only if everyone stops asking questions." The response was so quiet that no microphone captured it, yet the confidence in his voice contrasted sharply with the confusion filling the courtroom. Near the jury box, 12 ordinary citizens sat in complete silence. They had spent weeks listening to testimony about public trust, financial responsibility, and accountability under the law. Now they watched the lead prosecutor standing in handcuffs while the judge refused to issue a single ruling before examining every page himself. Several jurors glanced at one another. One elderly woman slowly closed the notebook she had filled throughout the trial. A middle-aged school principal, sitting beside her, whispered almost silently, "Something feels wrong." She did not mean the arrest itself. She meant the speed with which everyone outside the jury seemed ready to reach a conclusion. Judge Whitmore finally spoke, his voice calm enough to quiet the entire room. "No individual will be removed from this courtroom until the court completes its own review." The order immediately stopped several officers who had been preparing to escort Ava toward the exit. News commentators outside interpreted the delay in completely different ways. Some claimed the judge was protecting a colleague. Others suggested the legal system was attempting to avoid public embarrassment. None of them knew what Judge Whitmore had already noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the final authorization page, where a digital certification number appeared perfectly formatted, yet strangely inconsistent with federal filing procedures he had reviewed for decades. He reached for the courtroom clerk. "Please contact the clerk's office for immediate verification," he instructed. "I want confirmation directly from the issuing court." The clerk nodded and hurried through a side door. The room fell into an almost unbearable silence. Even the reporters stopped speaking. The only sound came from the ticking wall clock above the courtroom entrance, each passing second stretching longer than the one before it. Ava looked toward the American flag standing behind the bench, then back to Judge Whitmore without saying another word. She had placed her trust in the process she had defended her entire career. Now the process itself was about to reveal whether it still deserved that trust. No one spoke as the courtroom settled into a silence so complete that the faint hum of the ventilation system became impossible to ignore. Outside the tall windows, the late morning sunlight reflected from neighboring glass towers across downtown Atlanta, casting long bands of light across the polished floor where Ava Brooks remained standing without complaint. The handcuffs still rested around her wrists, yet her posture never changed. She neither pleaded nor protested. She simply waited. Judge Harold Whitmore continued studying the warrant one page at a time, with the patience of a man who had spent more than 4 decades believing that justice demanded careful attention instead of hurried conclusions. He compared signatures, reviewed filing numbers, and quietly turned each page while the entire courtroom watched every movement of his hands. The clerk returned only moments later, walking faster than courtroom protocol usually allowed before leaning toward the bench and speaking in a voice too soft for anyone else to hear. Judge Whitmore listened without interruption, then asked another question. The clerk answered again before immediately leaving through the same side door, this time carrying the warrant itself. Several reporters noticed the unexpected exchange and quickly began typing updates into their phones, but none of them knew what had been said. Their broadcast continued anyway, filling the silence outside the courtroom with speculation that changed every few minutes. Inside, however, speculation carried no authority. Only facts did. Marcus Ellis quietly observed every face in the room. He noticed Captain Daniel Reeves staring toward the floor more often than before, as though replaying every instruction he had received that morning. He noticed one of Caldwell's attorneys repeatedly checking his watch despite having nowhere else to be. Most of all, he noticed Richard Caldwell himself. The businessman who had appeared relaxed only minutes earlier no longer leaned comfortably in his chair. His fingers rested against the edge of the defense table with unusual tension, and although his expression remained carefully controlled, he had stopped making eye contact with anyone around him. Marcus had interviewed hundreds of witnesses throughout his career. He had learned that people often revealed more during silence than during conversation. Ava sensed the same shift without turning her head. Years inside courtrooms had taught her that truth often arrived quietly. She remembered something her father had once said while repairing an old wooden fence behind their home in Macon. Real strength is staying still when fear wants you to run. At the time, she had been only 16 years old and had not fully understood his words. Standing beneath the bright courtroom lights, she finally did. Fear encouraged quick reactions. Integrity required patience. A court officer approached Judge Whitmore with a printed memorandum that had just arrived from the clerk's office. The judge read it carefully before placing it beside the warrant. Then he reached for the courtroom telephone connected directly to administrative offices within the federal judiciary. No one could hear the person speaking on the other end, but everyone heard the judge's questions. "Please confirm the authorization number." He paused. "Yes, I will wait." Another long silence followed. Every ticking second seemed louder than the last. A juror folded her hands together. A reporter lowered his camera. Even the television lights appeared less harsh as the room settled into complete stillness. Finally, the judge spoke again. "You are absolutely certain?" Another pause. "Thank you." He slowly returned the receiver to its cradle without immediately looking up. Captain Reeves swallowed quietly. The clerk re-entered carrying another document and placed it beside the original warrant. Judge Whitmore examined both pages side by side. At first glance, they appeared almost identical, yet one detail separated them. The official court seal on the arrest warrant had been digitally reproduced with remarkable precision, but the embedded authentication sequence beneath it did not correspond to any record maintained by the issuing court. It was close enough to deceive nearly anyone performing a routine review. It was not close enough to survive direct verification. Judge Whitmore lifted his eyes across the courtroom, his expression calm but unmistakably changed. For the first time since the officers had entered, certainty replaced uncertainty. He looked directly toward Captain Daniel Reeves before quietly saying, "Captain, I believe every person in this courtroom is about to learn that appearances and truth have traveled very different paths this morning." Judge Harold Whitmore placed both documents on the bench where every attorney could see them, then removed his glasses with deliberate care before speaking into the heavy silence that had settled over the courtroom. "The issuing court has confirmed that this warrant does not exist within its official records," he said evenly. "The authorization sequence is invalid. The electronic certification has been fabricated, and the court whose name appears on this document has issued no such order." For several seconds, nobody reacted. The words seemed too extraordinary to process. Then the room erupted with stunned whispers. Reporters who had spent the past half hour announcing the arrest suddenly lowered their microphones, frantically rewriting headlines that had already spread across television stations and social media. Captain Daniel Reeves felt the color leave his face. Every procedure he had trusted that morning had been manipulated by someone who understood the federal system well enough to imitate it almost perfectly. He stepped toward Judge Whitmore without hesitation. "Your Honor, I respectfully request permission to remove the restraints immediately." The judge answered with a single nod. Reeves personally unlocked the handcuffs from Ava Brooks's wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed through the courtroom just as loudly as it had when they had first been secured, but this time it carried an entirely different meaning. Ava gently rubbed one wrist for only a moment before lowering both hands to her sides. She showed no anger toward the officers. Instead, she looked directly at Captain Reeves and quietly said, "Thank you for following the truth once you had the chance to see it." Reeves lowered his eyes briefly. "Counselor, I owe you an apology." Ava answered with calm sincerity. "You trusted the process. Someone abused that trust." Before anyone could say another word, the courtroom doors opened once again. Federal Bureau of Investigation Special Agent Marcus Ellis returned with 2 digital forensic specialists carrying secured evidence cases and laptop computers. One investigator walked directly to the courtroom technology station, while another handed Judge Whitmore a preliminary forensic report printed only minutes earlier. Marcus addressed the court. "Your Honor, after your request for immediate verification, our cyber response team traced the electronic transmission that delivered the fabricated warrant to courthouse security. The document did not originate from the federal judiciary. It was routed through a compromised private network designed to imitate official government communications." A ripple of disbelief swept through the gallery. Marcus continued. "Security camera recordings from the administrative offices also confirmed that no authorized court employee transmitted this document today. The false communication was introduced from outside the judicial network." Judge Whitmore studied the report before asking, "Have you identified the source?" Marcus nodded. "The investigation is still active, but the transmission appears connected to digital accounts already under review as part of the financial conspiracy before this court." Every eye slowly turned toward the defense table. Richard Caldwell remained seated, but the confidence that had surrounded him throughout the trial had disappeared. His attorneys began whispering urgently while reviewing documents that no longer seemed capable of protecting the narrative they had relied upon only moments before. One attorney quietly closed his briefcase without saying a word. Another requested a private conference with his client, but Judge Whitmore did not immediately respond. The jurors watched silently, absorbing every development with careful attention. The elderly woman who had closed her notebook earlier opened it again and calmly wrote a single sentence before setting down her pen. Around the courtroom, people who had rushed to judgment only minutes before now struggled to avoid meeting Ava's eyes. Television commentators corrected earlier statements as producers issued on-air updates acknowledging that the arrest had been based on fraudulent documentation rather than lawful authority. Judge Whitmore finally addressed the courtroom once more. "This court has witnessed an intentional attempt to interfere with an active federal proceeding through deception directed not only at the prosecution but also at officers of this court. Such conduct strikes at the integrity of the justice system itself." His words settled over the room with unmistakable weight. No applause followed. No celebration interrupted the moment. There was only silence as the truth replaced assumption. And within that silence, every person present understood that the trial they believed they had been watching had just become something far greater than a corruption case. It had become a test of whether justice could still recognize the truth, even after almost being led in the wrong direction. The silence that followed Judge Harold Whitmore's ruling carried more weight than any argument presented during the weeks of testimony. It was the kind of silence that forced people to confront not only what had happened, but also how quickly they had been willing to believe the worst. Captain Daniel Reeves stepped forward once more, standing before Ava Brooks with the dignity of a man determined to correct his own mistake. "Miss Brooks," he said clearly enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear, "I accepted a document that should have been questioned more carefully. I allowed procedure to replace judgment. I am sincerely sorry." Every camera captured the moment. Reporters who had spent the morning chasing dramatic headlines now focused on something far quieter. Ava looked at the veteran officer for a long moment before offering a gentle smile that surprised nearly everyone watching. "Captain," she replied, "you acted on information that was deliberately designed to deceive you. What defines us is not whether someone lies to us. It is what we do after we discover the truth. Reeves nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since entering the courtroom. Judge Whitmore then addressed Ava directly from the bench. "Counselor Brooks, this court regrets the humiliation you endured while carrying out your duty. Although the deception originated outside this courtroom, I recognize that the integrity of these proceedings depends upon restoring the trust that was unfairly placed at risk today." Ava inclined her head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor. I still believe this courtroom is where truth belongs." Those simple words settled over the room more powerfully than any emotional speech could have. One by one, members of the jury quietly rose from their seats. No instruction had been given. No protocol required the gesture. They simply stood together in respectful silence, acknowledging the composure of the woman who had refused to abandon her faith in the legal process, even while standing in handcuffs before the nation. The gallery followed almost instinctively. Several spectators lowered their eyes with visible embarrassment, remembering the whispers they had exchanged only minutes earlier. Television commentators paused as producers signaled them to stop talking and simply let the pictures tell the story. Marcus Ellis watched the scene with quiet satisfaction. During years of federal service, he had witnessed countless investigations, difficult trials, and public controversies, but he had rarely seen a moment when dignity changed the atmosphere of an entire room. He walked toward Ava carrying the evidence binder she had left on counsel table before the interruption. "I believe this still belongs to you," he said with a small smile. Ava accepted the binder and gently brushed an imaginary speck of dust from its cover. "We still have a witness waiting," she answered. Marcus laughed softly. "Only you would think about testimony after everything that just happened." Ava looked toward the witness stand where the compliance manager remained seated, still under oath, patiently waiting for the court's direction. "The people of this country deserve answers," she said. "They have waited long enough." Across the defense table, Richard Caldwell no longer appeared like the confident executive who had entered the courthouse that morning. His attorneys quietly reorganized their files, but the rhythm of the courtroom had changed in a way no legal strategy could reverse. The discussion was no longer centered on the accusations against the prosecutor. It had become focused on the extraordinary effort someone had made to prevent the trial from reaching its conclusion. Judge Whitmore lifted his gavel and looked carefully across the courtroom before speaking. "These proceedings will continue. The attempt to interfere with this court has failed, and this court will not permit deception to replace justice." The gavel came down with one measured strike. No one applauded. No one celebrated. Instead, Ava calmly returned to the prosecution table, opened the same legal pad she had carefully aligned before the interruption, and turned to the page where her notes ended. She thanked the witness for his patience, walked back toward the lectern with steady confidence, and asked the next question exactly as she had intended before the false warrant had interrupted the morning. In that ordinary moment, every person in the courtroom understood that real strength was not found in revenge, louder voices, or public humiliation. It was found in the quiet decision to continue serving the truth after every reason to lose faith had already passed. Several weeks later, the summer heat over downtown Atlanta softened beneath a clear evening sky as the final chapter of the case quietly unfolded inside the same federal courthouse where confusion had once threatened to overshadow the truth. This time, there were no breaking news banners flashing across television screens before the facts were known. Reporters waited patiently for official statements. Journalists who had rushed to judgment during the morning of the fabricated warrant had learned an unforgettable lesson about the cost of assuming guilt before evidence had been examined. The corruption trial concluded after the jury carefully reviewed weeks of testimony, financial records, electronic communications, and witness statements presented under oath. The evidence painted a complete picture that no fabricated distraction could erase. Additional federal investigations, launched after the attempted interference with the court, uncovered a coordinated effort involving fraudulent digital communications, unauthorized access to secure systems, and deliberate attempts to undermine public confidence in the judicial process. Those responsible faced their own legal proceedings through the same system they had tried to manipulate. Judge Harold Whitmore later reflected that the integrity of a courtroom depended not upon perfection but upon the willingness to correct mistakes the moment they became visible. His remarks were quoted across newspapers throughout the country, not because they were dramatic, but because they reminded people that accountability belonged to everyone, including the institutions entrusted with justice. Captain Daniel Reeves returned to his duties with renewed determination, introducing additional verification procedures for emergency judicial communications so that no officer under his command would ever again be forced to rely upon appearances alone. During one quiet afternoon, he encountered Ava Brooks near the courthouse entrance. He stopped, extended his hand, and thanked her once more for responding with grace instead of resentment. Ava accepted the handshake warmly. "We both protected the same system," she told him. "We simply reached the truth from different directions." Reeves smiled with visible relief. "I will remember that for the rest of my career." Marcus Ellis continued working alongside federal investigators as the expanded inquiry moved forward. He often joked that Ava had an unusual talent for turning impossible cases into history lessons about patience. She always answered with the same quiet smile before returning to another stack of files waiting on her desk. Despite national attention, interview requests, and invitations to appear on television, she declined nearly every opportunity. Recognition had never been the reason she entered public service. Her work remained exactly what it had always been, preparing carefully, respecting every person inside the courtroom, and allowing evidence to speak louder than headlines. Months after the trial ended, a group of law students from Georgia visited the courthouse during an educational program. One student recognized Ava in the hallway and nervously asked how she had remained calm when so many people believed something untrue about her. Ava paused before answering. "Your reputation belongs to other people," she said gently. "Your character belongs to you. Never trade one for the other." The students stood quietly, writing down every word. As the courthouse gradually emptied that evening, sunlight reflected across the marble floor in long golden lines that reached almost to the courtroom doors. Judge Whitmore stepped into the hallway, carrying a worn leather briefcase. Ava was gathering her notes after another ordinary day of work. Their eyes met for only a moment. Neither of them spoke. They simply exchanged a respectful nod before continuing in opposite directions. Outside, the American flag moved gently in the warm Georgia breeze above the courthouse steps where visitors, attorneys, families, and public servants passed one another without knowing how close justice had once come to being misled. The city continued with its familiar rhythm as traffic flowed through the streets and evening light settled across the skyline. Inside the courthouse, the benches stood empty once again, the microphones silent, and the witness stand waiting for another case on another day. Yet the memory left behind was not the sound of handcuffs or the noise of hurried accusations. It was the quiet strength of one woman who trusted the truth long enough for the truth to find its own voice, proving that genuine justice is never measured by the speed of judgment, but by the courage to keep searching until every fact stands in the light.